In this video, we're going to look at a small segment from one of the masterclasses. If you want to see the full masterclass, just go through the channel and I'm sure you'll find it somewhere. Otherwise, make sure you subscribe and you'll know whenever next we publish some free content to this channel. Thank you. Enjoy. Could you explain to our viewers, what is it exactly that you do?
Well, the sound designer's job, ideally, is to help the director figure out what a project, what a film is going to sound like. Some writers and some directors have lots of very specific ideas about how sound can be used in their stories, but many don't. Probably the majority don't. And it's partly because we're just not used to thinking of sound in the same way that we think of visual images. We tend to be very analytical about visual images and not very analytical about sound. So typically when I begin working with a director, she or he will have some notions about how sound is going to work in the film. You know, in The Incredibles, there's this flying saucer looking vehicle that the evil minions flew around in called the Velocipod, and we knew it was going to be fast and it should sound fast, but we really had no idea how to get there. Since it's animated, there obviously was no sound being recorded on the set, so we had to invent it from scratch. And the only way that we figured it out was by trial and error, making lots of mistakes, and just experimenting.
You worked with Brad Bird on several occasions. You worked on Iron Giant and on Ratatouille. You won the Oscar well, you won more than one Oscar, but you won an Oscar for The Incredibles. Now, what is it that wins Oscars? What is it that people look out for when they're voting? And have you figured that out over your plus 40 years of career?
I think it's very rare that a film gets nominated for an Oscar in any category where the work is really, substandard or doesn't deserve an award of any kind. How you decide which is the most deserving is still a bit of a mystery to me. Take the film editing category, for instance. How in the world can you figure out how well a film was edited unless you know what the editor had to work with? I knew the editor of the movie Dances with Wolves because I worked with him on a project, and he told me that was perhaps the easiest job he ever had in his career. And it was the only film that he won an Oscar for. And he said the irony was that he had, on several other films, worked miracles to turn the film into something enormously better than it had been. Whereas he jokingly said that virtually all he had to do on Dances with Wolves was to cut off the slates because it just, it happened to be written and directed and performed in a way that just worked. No miracles in post-production were necessary. So isn't it ironic that that's the one Oscar that he received? There's similarly problematic things with sound as well. Too often the film that gets nominated for an Oscar for sound or wins an Oscar for sound is, the loudest film, or the film with the most sounds, rather than the film with the most interesting and useful sounds. So I'm always happy when it's not a war film.
Because I think you won 2 Oscars, right, for Incredibles and The Right Stuff?
Yeah.
If you had to vote for your own work, what would be at the top?
I don't know. I was very proud of what we did on the film Contact, Robert Zemeckis' film, Jodie Foster. I didn't think that film received the recognition that it should have, either as a film or as a sound job. Certainly the sequence when Jodie Foster first enters this huge mechanism that is going to transport her into another dimension or another universe was a big challenge, and I think it was one that we pulled off well, partly because Zemeckis, the director, told me early on that he thought it would probably play best with just sound effects without musical score. And so when I hear that from a director, it's at the same time a thrill and terribly frightening, because I know there's a lot of responsibility on my shoulders to do a lot of storytelling with just the sound design. But visually, and in terms of the other dynamics of the sequence, it was set up to be a really wonderful open door to sound design. So I was lucky that was the case, and it made my work quite a bit easier than it would have been otherwise. For one thing, there is virtually no dialogue in the sequence. There is something about the human voice that we as humans are obsessed with. And so if there is dialogue in a given moment, even if you can't understand the dialogue, it's just natural for our ears to concentrate on that to the exclusion of everything else. And so I'm often asked by directors to attempt to shoehorn sound design into a dialogue sequence, and it just never works because we just don't pay attention to any sound other than the people talking, the characters talking. So the fact that that sequence and several in that film had very little dialogue was a great opportunity for the sound design.
What about Wild at Heart? Wild at Heart is a romance, a wild romance. Doesn't seem to, at first sight, have these massive challenges of these other films. What was the most memorable scene from that film for you?
Yeah, believe it or not, Wild at Heart was one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. And it's partly because David Lynch's expectations are so high, and he is an improviser. He likes to do everything in the moment. So, for instance, we typically go through this process in film mixing called pre-mixing, in which we put the various sounds that we have edited together into categories so that all the tracks of thunder will be in one group, and the tracks of wind will be in another group, and the rain will be in another group, etc. And David told me that he didn't want to do any pre-mixing, that he wanted to just improvise everything during the final mix. And so this whole mix was very much an improvisation, and we didn't know from moment to moment what was going to be in the film in terms of sound and what wasn't, but that's just the way that he likes to work. So I was in charge of the sound editing and in charge of the sound mix for that film, and so it put a huge amount of pressure on me. I remember at the end of the project, I told my girlfriend, I'm never going to work on a film again. This is it. This has drained everything from me. I have no energy left. But of course, a day or two later, I was back at it, getting ready to work on another film. But sometimes, in fact, very often, a scene that you wouldn't think would be a big challenge for sound design can be a huge challenge. For instance, in Wild at Heart, there are several scenes with the two principal characters smoking. And David really wanted to capture the sound of smoking and the sound of the embers at the end of the cigarette, etc. And so we worked very, very hard to try to come up with a set of sounds that would work. And most of the sounds in that sequence are not cigarettes at all. There are other kinds of things burning. If you're any good as a sound designer, you're constantly thinking in terms of metaphor. You're not thinking, okay, there's a shot of a cigarette burning. I should just go record a cigarette, and that's it. That's the end of my job. You're always thinking in terms of how should we feel about this character who's smoking this cigarette in this moment, and what sounds can I use related to the cigarette or related to other sounds that will push that idea or that feeling, that story point forward in some way. So yeah, we spent as long working on the sound of cigarettes in Wild at Heart as I did, working on space battles in in certain other films. My first questions to a director who I haven't worked with before usually revolve around the style of the film. I try to get a sense of what the overall style of the film is going to be. For instance, when I had initial discussions with Brad Bird about The Incredibles, he had in mind that it was going to be a little bit like a James Bond film. And so as soon as he said that, that helped me quite a bit understand the kind of world that we were going to be entering, and at least the universe that I might place some of the sounds in. And so that became the basis for deeper questions that followed. A long tradition of cinematographers and production designers having lots and lots and lots of meetings with directors in pre-production to talk about what the film is going to look like. And so I often point out, why doesn't that happen for sound? Why do we think of sound as this thing that's supposed to kind of magically appear out of nowhere in post-production? Why don't we have those same kinds of conversations early on regarding sound? Because very often a sound idea can and should influence the way a scene is shot. And I'll give you an example. Early in Apocalypse Now, there's this scene where the Martin Sheen character, Captain Willard, is lying in his crummy Saigon hotel room. He's hallucinating and he's drunk and he's remembering these horrific things that have happened to him as a soldier, an American soldier in Vietnam, and the terrible things he's seen. As he's lying in bed, he gazes up and looks at a ceiling fan. That ceiling fan was certainly not in the script, and it was never in the script that he would see a ceiling fan or anything else and hear a helicopter. Luckily, Coppola shot Marty's POV of the ceiling fan, and luckily, Walter Murch, who was one of the film editors on Apocalypse and in charge of the sound, thought, those spinning blades look a little like helicopter rotors, and helicopters are quite a theme in this movie, so maybe he's seeing a ceiling fan and hearing a helicopter. So that did not occur to John Milius, the initial screenwriter on the film, or to Francis when he was doing rewrites. But why shouldn't it have? Why couldn't it have occurred to the writer? Because what that whole sequence is about is the filter of Captain Willard's brain. You're not really hearing Saigon, and you're not really hearing the jungle in his memories. What you're hearing and often seeing in that sequence is his perception, his memories, the way that his mind is filtering these things that he's experienced. The biggest difference between the Milius script and the script that Francis wound up with was that at a certain point, Coppola decided that he really wanted it to be about POV, the whole film. He wanted it to be the point of view of those American soldiers in Vietnam, and that's not really the way John Milius had written it. a lot of the great things in the film were certainly in the Milius script. I love the smell of napalm in the morning, etc. That was all there. But the overall style of the film changed quite a bit as Coppola's perception of it evolved during the making of the film. And POV is almost always an open door to sound. So if you can write a scene so that it's clear to the audience that what they're experiencing is being filtered through the consciousness of one or more of the characters in the scene, that enormous latitude to be subjective, to be stylized, to be musical, and not to be bound by what's literal about the scene. So that decision of Coppola's to make so many of those sequences in Apocalypse Now very much point of view sequences is what opened the door that Walter Murch walked through so brilliantly. The scene in The Godfather when Michael Corleone goes into the restaurant bathroom to retrieve a pistol that's been hidden there for him so that he can assassinate this corrupt policeman and another mafia guy. We know that character, Michael Corleone, is torn between this life that he thought he was going to try to live, as an ex-soldier and getting away from his mafia family and living, the straight life, the normal life, instead of being a professional criminal. All that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that his father, his family, these people who he's grown up loving are in the middle of that criminal world. And he can't help but be drawn into it out of allegiance and love. And his compatriots have hidden this pistol in the restaurant bathroom.
I have to go to the bathroom. Is that all right?
You gotta go, you gotta go. I frisked him. He's clean.
Don't take too long. I frisked 1,000 young folks.
So he excuses himself, goes to the bathroom to get the pistol, but while he's in the bathroom, he is incredibly torn about whether he's going to be able to go through with it. The typical filmmaker would have used musical score to underpin that idea, that tension that's going on inside of Michael Corleone's brain. But Coppola was brilliant enough to avoid that and do it in a much more interesting way. And he and Walter Murch scored the scene with the sound of a train. You never see a train outside this restaurant. There are no windows through which you might see a train in the bathroom. But we all know that in big cities, there are these elevated trains, and very often they're right next to a building that you may be in, like a restaurant. And only after he shoots the guys does the score begin, the musical score, this grand kind of operatic score. And it was such a brilliant way to do it, because that way the music has even more impact than if you had been hearing musical score through the whole sequence. Well, as a sound designer, I'm almost always grateful for any sound help that I get from a writer. It would never occur to me to say, well, who does she think she is to be writing about sound? I'm the sound designer. I think just the opposite. I'm always feel like celebrating when a writer thinks enough about sound to work sound, deeply into a story. There are rules for writing a spec script, which are very different from the rules that you write from the way that you write if you're writing with a director or for a director who you already have a relationship with and who is kind of simpatico to that kind of thinking. And so the way I talk about writing is very much focused on the latter kind of writing, where you're working on a greenlit project, you're working with a director who has faith in you to take some license in terms of making suggestions about what things look like and what things sound like. And, the director can always just say, I don't like that idea. And as a sound designer, I can do the same. If the writer writes something specific about the way a sound is going to work in a scene, I can always just have a conversation with the director and say, I really appreciate that the writer tried to do this, but I think if we do it in a little bit different way, it'll work better.
Now, we've looked at how sound can essentially reduce the cost of your film. Are there also unexpected situations for the writer, that we're not aware of, where sound can be expensive?
Excellent question. Large crowds of people, for instance, chanting something specific, can be problematic in terms of sound, because if you don't get a good enough recording of it during production, it can be pretty expensive to fake in post-production, because you need to bring together a similarly large crowd of people and find the right kind of venue to record them in. Sound is generally so cheap compared to visuals that it's almost insignificant. So, as you say, it's as a writer, you can certainly save the production a lot of money if you can figure out how to do things with sound that you don't have to see. And people often ask me, what's the difference between working on animated films and live action films? And there really aren't as many differences as you might think. And one of the reasons is that even the live action films that I work on might as well be animated, because so many of the scenes are done with computer graphics and don't really exist in the real world. So we have to invent the entire sonic world for them in post-production.
Are there other things that you've learned from working in the industry, from working on good scripts, worse scripts, better scripts? Any technique that you've learned about writing from all those years working with film?
I know that, character is enormously important, and the arc that a character takes is enormously important. I know that hanging, interesting question marks in the air in the beginning of a story is often the key to a really interesting story. The trick is to use ambiguity, but don't try to avoid getting used by it. Obviously, if things are too confusing or too ambiguous, people will give up on trying to figure out what's going on. But if you give the reader enough clues so that they can bring their own experience into the act of reading it, I think that's where the sweet spot is in terms of storytelling.
When you're writing, do you need to turn off your sound mind? Does that come in, your experience while you're writing?
No, I don't think so. I've written several things about, several essays about writing for sound, screenwriting for sound specifically. And I'm a big proponent of screenwriters thinking more in terms of sound when they're writing. I know very well that if you're trying to write a spec script, one of the things you're bound to do is to try to keep the description of any kind to a minimum, because so many of the people who read spec scripts are really going to be distracted by or bored by too much description. I like to think that my main concern is not, in terms of trying to figure out how to write, is not the spec script, it's the script that actually gets made. It's the rewriting of the script that already has some momentum that I'm probably more interested in, because at that point, you really are interested in helping the director figure out, what the story is going to be. And so if you can do what I call give the character ears, sometimes give the camera ears, it's going to help the director a lot. If the director is open to such things, and I think most directors are. I often say that the way to open the door to sound is to starve the eye. So there are certain visual techniques that swing the door wide open to doing interesting things with sound. Slow motion, black and white photography, Dutch angles, which basically means kind of odd camera angles, smoke, fog, steam, darkness in one corner of the frame. All of these are introduce one or another kind of ambiguity visually. It's a question mark. And there's something about that in human perception that switches a little switch in our brains that tells our ears that they need to help figure out what's going on. And likewise, I think the less sound there is, the more the audience are attuned to the visual images. If for no other reason than the brain is not, overloaded with too much visual information and sonic information at the same time. I'm often, when I have the opportunity to talk to a writer who's maybe doing a rewrite on a film that I'm working on, or to the director early on, and they say they're really interested in using sound in a certain way in the sequence, I'll say, if there's any way to simplify what's going on visually, it'll help me enormously as a sound person.
People say they're actually the director's business, black and white, slow-mo, Dutch angle. How would you signal any of that in the screenplay?
Well, you'll certainly get in trouble if you start indicating that kind of stuff, in a spec screenplay, because that's not what people are expecting to see. And they'll say, that's not your business. It's the director's job to figure that out. And I don't think that's a good thing, that's the way the world of screenwriting works, but that is the way it works. And so I think the application for a lot of that is not in a spec script. It's further down the line, when, as I say, when a rewrite is being done on something that's already been greenlit, or when the director is in pre-production on something and really just beginning to figure out what it's going to look like. Yeah, there really aren't that many scripts that that I've read that I think are great sound scripts. I think the shooting script that Coppola assembled for Apocalypse Now is certainly a great sound script. The Coen brothers are very conscious of sound and are very sophisticated about sound. And I think No Country for Old Men is an excellently written script for sound. Barton Fink is another.
Welcome to the Hotel Earl. May I help you, sir?
Blue Velvet, another David Lynch film. You know, the first half of the film The Black Stallion, Walter Murch, by the way, did some writing on The Black Stallion that was uncredited. But the first half of the film has very little dialogue and is really a tour de force for visuals and sound. And that's partly because Carol Ballard, the director, is a natural kind of documentary filmmaker, and much of it is shot as if it were a documentary. Those are a few films that I think were well written for sound.
Thank you so much, Randy. This was a true masterclass. This was a genuine masterclass on writing for sound. I'm so happy that you accepted our invitation. It's been wonderful.
Well, let's do it again in a year or two, and because there's so much ground to cover, I think we could do another show.
I'd certainly be up for that, and we might use one of your films that you worked on as a basis, as a study, as a case.
Okay, well, thanks so much for the invitation. It was fun.
Thank you. Cheers. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give us a like. Even better, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to be notified next time we post free content here, make sure you push the bell button. There's a lot more here on this channel. Browse around. We have short snippets. We have full-length 1-hour masterclasses. And there's certainly something in there to your taste. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you next time. Bye.